Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, dividends everywhere, but not a drop of water to drink. OK, that is an exaggeration, but we are facing the prospect of an official drought. Millions of people have had hosepipe bans already, and 2.4 billion litres of water are wasted in England every day thanks to leaky pipes. Yet figures obtained by the Lib Dems show that in the last 2 years, executives at water and sewage companies paid themselves more than £27 million in bonuses, benefits and other incentives, and overall gave themselves £48 million in pay. In Scotland and Wales, though, water is run on a non-profit basis. We're going to hear from Martin Lyons. Martin is an arable farmer in Cambridgeshire and the UK chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and also from Cat Hobbs from the pressure group We Own It. Before we do, though, just a quick reminder that Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast are funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times, our wonderful monthly newspaper, edited by Hardeep Matharu. We are not bankrolled by oligarchs or non-doms. We can report without fear or favour and hold the rich and the powerful to account because our funding comes from ordinary subscribers, people like you. So please subscribe, if you can, to the Byline Times. You get more details at our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com. And if you have already subscribed, thank you. Martin, Kat, hello. How are you both? You all right?
Hello.
Very well. Good afternoon.
Yeah, lovely to have you both on. Martin, I want to have a chat with you firstly and just tell us what you do in Cambridgeshire as an arable farmer and what impact this kind of weather is having on you.
Yeah, so we're predominantly an arable-based farm, growing combinable crops like wheat, barley, beans. We also have some land we have some sheep grazing on. And the current dry period has been going on for months, and we just haven't seen any rain on our crops. So that means the output will be down on our spring crops, and it's a really precarious time. And for many farmers who have access to water, taking it from rivers or underground water supplies or reservoirs, that's also running out. So many farmers are going to see less production in the coming months.
And what does that mean for us then as consumers?
Well, we're going to see less crops available. The quality of some of the vegetables and other things won't be as nice because you won't have the moisture to fill and swell those fruits and vegetables. But we also need the supermarkets to recognise the challenge we have, so more of the produce fits on the shelves.
So does that mean perhaps being a bit more liberal in terms of what they deem to be acceptable as a vegetable to sell?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing stories this week of where the cauliflowers haven't quite made the specification of being big enough because there was lack of moisture. So the whole crop gets destroyed because the supply chain doesn't want to change its specification.
Seriously? Although we're encouraged these days to buy wonky vegetables or strange fruit, very often then the supermarkets will simply reject them because they believe that we as consumers don't want them.
That's right. And we're seeing huge food waste at a time when the cost of food is going up for everybody and farmers are getting forced to throw food away. I think it's a terrible shame.
I mentioned a figure there that 2.4 billion litres of water are wasted in England every day thanks to leaky pipes. Now, assuming I could wave a magic wand and end those leaks, would that make any difference to your farming practices on a day-to-day basis?
Not to my farm, because the water that comes through pipes is for drinking and for watering livestock. We need that groundwater reservoir. What we're finding is the water companies are pumping more and more water out of the ground reservoirs. That means there's lower in the water table, and lots of that water they're pumping into the pipes, they're allowing to leak and drain away. So it's just a complete waste of a product.
But there is a connection then between the lack of water, for example, for watering your garden, the water that is sometimes then wasted through the leaking pipes because of where it's extracted, and your ability to farm.
Absolutely, definitely. Farmers are having water restrictions put on them now because the water companies take priority. So they are taking the first draw out of any underground reservoir or watercourse, and the farmers is the last in their line. So that means our food production can't be watered to put the food on the table this winter.
Yeah. Just curious as well, I'm sure listeners will be interested to know this. You're an arable farmer, so that's vegetables and crops and so on. Is the same kind of pressure generated by drought on meat and dairy farmers?
Yeah, because many of the livestock farmers have had cut some hay or silage, but it's like our lawns, the grass has stopped growing. So instead of using that food in the winter, they're starting to have to feed the livestock now, their winter rations. So it's causing huge problems for the livestock farmers.
You say that we've had this drought coming for months now. It's been building up for months. Is this just one of those things? Or as a farmer, do you look at climate change and think this is something that we're going to have to get used to?
The science and the facts clearly show that our summers are going to become more volatile. We're going to have hotter, drier summers and sometimes really wet summers. But that volatility is coming, and we seem to see little practical action into getting ready for the climate crisis we're currently facing.
Yeah, you feel that the water companies, that we as a nation are not gearing up for what are inevitable problems being stood?
Not at all. I mean, there's no urgency and there's no rush to get this done. They're talking of projects in 10 and 20 years' time. We were allowing too much leakage, and we're allowing that to happen now. This needs tackling now, or else we won't have enough water, particularly in the southeast, to water the crops, to water the population, and all the needs we want to have from our water supply.
Cat Hobbs is with us from We Own It. And Cat, you're a pressure group that believes in public ownership of our water resources. What difference do you think it would make in this current situation?
So I think, as Martin said, we're in a situation where we've got climate crisis already. It's going to get worse. And, sorry to be gloomy, but they're predicting that England will have water shortages in 25 years' time. But of course, right now in hot summers, we have shortages. And what we have is privatised water companies in England who their priority is not to take care of our countryside, take care of our rivers and seas, help out our farmers, lower bills for consumers. Their priority is to make money for their shareholders and for their CEOs. So since our water was privatised by Margaret Thatcher in 1989, shareholders have received on average around £2 billion a year. That's all money that could have been reinvested back into our infrastructure to tackle leaks, to make sure that we have clean rivers and seas. The CEOs of these water companies, as you highlighted, there's been the story about bonuses in the news today. On average, those CEOs earn £1.7 million a year. So the money is flowing to investors all around the world. It's flowing to the CEOs. It's not flowing into delivering the infrastructure that this country actually needs.
I find it intriguing that we have a UK government, but of course we have various devolved parliaments. And although Scotland and Wales have a different model to each other, in both cases, in Scotland and Wales, water is run on a non-profit basis. So it's not as though within these islands it is a radical thought to suggest that water companies should not be treated as some kind of commodity.
I think that's a really good point. The model that we have in England is actually a very strange one. We didn't just give private companies the right to operate water services to deliver our water. We actually sold off our assets wholesale to private companies. So, so for example, in other countries like France, they did privatise water, but they did it with contracts, and now they've brought those in-house, and they've been able to, many cities in France have been bringing water back into public ownership because privatisation failed. But as you say, we don't even need to go as far as France. If you look at what's happening in Scotland, where you have Scottish Water, that's a really great example of what public ownership can deliver. So the Scots weren't happy to let Thatcher privatise their water. Nobody in the UK actually thought that water privatisation was a good idea. People could see that it didn't make sense. But the Scots really pushed back against it. And so Scottish Water is in public ownership, and it invests £72 more per household per year. So what that means in terms of big picture investment in infrastructure is that if England had copied the Scottish model, we would have spent £28 billion more on improving our infrastructure since privatisation. And you can imagine how that might have meant we don't get the kind of sewage leaks that we see in our rivers and seas. We have healthy rivers and seas. We save more water, we mend pipes and infrastructure instead of just letting that money leak away with the water.
It's not as though the water companies have invested nothing, though, is it? I'm looking at figures here from Ofwat, which is the water regulator, and they look at the total expenditure of water companies. And between 2005 2010, something in excess of £10 billion was invested. It did fall a little under £10 billion. This is the aggregate investment by water companies. It did fall just below £10 billion between 2010 and 2015. And between 2015 and 2020, it has increased again above £10 billion. So although it makes a great headline to talk about the bonuses and the wages given to water company executives, in fairness, those private companies are themselves making investments. And if they didn't make the investment, if they didn't exist to make the investment, then we as taxpayers would have to make that investment, and that would mean higher taxation.
Well, that's not quite right. So what's happened is that the water companies have used our bills to invest. So they haven't added anything to the picture. So if you look at what's happened since privatisation, the water companies started out, they had the debt written off. So there was zero debt when they started out in 1989. They've built up a debt mountain over the past 30 years of £53 billion. And then they've spent £72 billion on shareholders. So what they've essentially done is they've used the fact that they've got monopolies to leverage that into more money. So it's a kind of financialized system where they make money because they have guaranteed revenue. And so, have they ever invested anything into the infrastructure? Yes, they have, but that's been from our bills, our money that we've been giving them. And by the way, the promise of privatisation was supposed to be our bills would go down and we'd get higher quality services. Instead, our bills have gone up by 40%. And I would argue we've got absolutely terrible services with, the fact that they haven't been able to deal with the most basic kind of infrastructure investment. There was a brief increase in investment at the start of privatisation. That was a lot to do with EU rules around making sure that we clean up rivers and seas, and then it's just completely flatlined. And if you look at the money that shareholders put in, there's a very interesting graph on the National Audit Office website which shows the money that they put in just kind of a flat line, and then the massive increase in debt that they've had since privatisation. So they've been using their position to make as much money as possible for their investors, which is what private companies do. You can't blame them for that, but why would we put them in charge of such a crucial bit of infrastructure, such a crucial asset for this country?
So when Ofwat say, and I'm quoting now from their website, as I say, this is the water regulator fact, investments has roughly doubled since privatisation in 1989. You're not questioning the fact that investment in the water industry has doubled since 1989. You're saying, though, that the money for that investment hasn't come from risk-taking shareholders. It has come from customers themselves, the profits from their water bills being ploughed back into the industry, which would happen anyway if it were publicly owned.
Exactly. And as I say, we have to make that comparison with how we could have done it. We have to look at Scotland, where if we'd done it the way Scotland's done it, we'd have spent an extra £28 billion. Of course, there has to be investment. A lot of this infrastructure is quite old. It needs upgrading. Money has to be spent. But what private companies do when they take over public services, especially things like water, is they get public investment for things like, the Thames super sewer, and they use our bills and the money that we give them to make investment while returning a very, very healthy profit for their shareholders. And I think it's really important to stress the fact that water is a monopoly. It's a fairly obvious point, but it's really crucial. You don't get a choice about your water company, who you pay your bills to. I pay Thames Water. That's it. They're my water company. I'm not a consumer in a market, choosing, and neither is anyone else. And so what we really need is, these companies to actually have public purpose embedded in how they operate. But instead, they're thinking about their shareholders in Canada, in Australia, in Hong Kong, Malaysia, China, and making sure that those investors are getting their return.
Martin, from a farmer's perspective, does it matter who runs your water company, or is the key thing ensuring that water is available to you?
I think key thing is water's available, but also the investment in the infrastructure, because actually in the southeast we've seen huge amounts of development, so we're going to have a growth area at the driest area of the country. And how are we going to move water about and manage it strategically at a national scale? And I think that's where we really need to be looking at is what is the plan for the future, and how do we get some of that shareholder dividend helping to invest in some of that plan.
Yeah. And from a farmer's point of view, then, you seem to be saying, not from an ideological perspective, but just because it would help one of the core industries of this country, we need a national eye on this, some national coordination to ensure that we adapt properly for climate change and that people like you are able to do your job as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, that's right. And we also must look at the winter flows. How do we store more water at those high rainfall events rather than just let it run out? Where do we have the landscape capacity to hold and slow the flow and store that for those drier periods? We're not short on water. We just don't use it very efficiently. And at those high flow rates, we let off out to the sea when we should be storing more of it for those drier periods.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point as well. Cat making a very important point about how we as consumers don't really have a choice. It's not as though I can say, living in Birmingham, I don't want Severn Trent, thank you very much. I'm going to get my supplies from Thames Water. That isn't an option that is available to me. And in the same way, if you've got water coming from the skies into England, it's not as though we don't have enough water, we just aren't storing it, conserving it and using it well enough. There isn't, in that sense, a water shortage at all.
No, I know many farmers have been seeing the climate change, and they're changing their farming practices to make their soil healthier and filtrate water more and store water more within the fields. But also some are investing into water storage facilities because they are getting increasingly concerned with the availability on these dry periods. So the farmers are trying to do their part, but we just need that bigger national strategy to make sure this works at a fair pace, because times are getting tight and the water's getting less and we need to act fast.
Yeah, Kat, it strikes me, at the moment we're hearing various appeals to, we've all got a part to play to reduce our water consumption. And my sense is that if we had a water industry that was collectively owned, then appealing to that collective responsibility would be more effective than at the moment, where we're told that we're all part of the solution, but we don't all share in the very handsome rewards if water is saved.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, people understand that it's hot in the summer and you have to use water carefully. Most people understand that, that situation will get worse. There will be more shortages, expected in this country. So we have to be planning for this now. But I think you're absolutely right. Right now, there's a handful of people who are profiting who aren't really part of finding the solution. But actually, both individuals and communities, lots of people want to help create solutions. People feel worried about climate change. They feel like they want to look after the natural environment. They want English rivers and seas to have, fish in them and to have wildlife and to be part of creating positive change in the world. And I think it would be a lot easier to do that with public ownership. And that wouldn't be the kind of, the sort of stereotype of top-down public ownership. It would be about communities being part of a public solution for people rather than profit. And, the publicly owned water companies could have a remit and a mandate to work really closely with, for example, river action groups around the country who want to clean up our rivers. It completely breaks my heart at the moment when you hear these stories about what's happening to our wildlife. I know that's one bit of it that maybe some people don't think about, but lots of people do. And, and the impact that has on wildlife, but also on communities. Like, people don't want to jump in the river or the sea anymore because they're scared about getting sick. And rightly so, because, a survey from Surfers Against Sewage showed that around half of people have got sick after doing wild swimming, because of the level of pollution. So, yes, I think people want positive solutions to these problems. And at the moment, privatisation is a real barrier to that.
One thing that I don't quite understand, and maybe you can enlighten me, is that there have been a lot of reports about some water companies anyway pumping raw sewage into rivers or into the sea. So one of them, for example, Southern Water, was fined £90 million for dumping raw sewage off the south coast between 2010 and 2015. Given that there is this action taken against them, how can it be in their financial interest to dump raw sewage? It costs them money.
Well, I think the thing is that what they don't want to do is invest the significant sums of money needed to upgrade the infrastructure. So they would rather pay the fines that they're given for killing thousands of fish, making children sick, etc., than actually make that investment. So they've made a cold hard calculation, and the fact is that yes, fines that are millions of pounds sound like quite a lot of money, but when you think about the fact that shareholders make £2 billion every year, that these chief execs are earning millions of pounds already, actually these fines are too small to have a real impact.
So you think that the water companies see these fines as part of the cost of doing business?
Exactly. They factor it in, it's essentially small change to them. And what you've got is a situation also where the Environment Agency has been increasingly underfunded, so it cannot take on these water companies and what they're doing. The water companies effectively mark their own homework. They report on, sewage leaks and all of that. And so, the whole industry is in a complete mess, really, where they can get away with anything, and just pay the fine. And as you say, see that as a cost of doing business. I just think it's a disgraceful way to treat our natural environment. We should have a company with a public purpose that has a duty to look after our countryside and our rivers and to look after the natural resources that we've got in this country. And that has to be the future.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen a number of water companies, sadly, in recent years. I mean, that most recent incident, Southern Water, there we refer back was 2015, but we have seen, sadly, a continuation from other companies of sewage being dumped into rivers and seas. Southern say these were related to activities which took place about 7 years ago. They say they have made huge changes in their business, and they say in terms of the management, the culture, it absolutely doesn't happen today. Martin, before we go, I just want to ask you one final question, and it's a simple one. If you were in charge of the water industry in England and you were viewing it from your perspective as a farmer, what would you do? What do we need to do to help you?
Have a joined up approach to landscape scale of holding and storing more water, putting an investment into that infrastructure and stopping the leaks, and getting communities, businesses and everybody on board. This is for everybody to do, and no one business should be profiteering out of it more than anyone else. And we all need to pull together and actually plan for the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis we have in front of us, and actually deliver at a landscape scale.
Cat, before we go then, what's the one thing you would say to the government? Because clearly, from the current government's perspective, the ownership of water companies isn't on the agenda. Your campaign isn't on the agenda. How would you persuade them that it ought to be?
I would say a majority of red wall voters think that water should be in public ownership. It's always around 60 to 70% of the population think water should be in public ownership. And And that's because the system isn't working right now. It's working for shareholders around the world. It's not working for the people of this country. And we have a government that did promise us that it would take back control, and if that was supposed to mean that we would have some kind of control over key industries in this country, key public services, well, right now we have no control. And so we do need to actually have control of these water companies, which are doing absolutely essential work. We can't do without them. None of us can do without them. So why not have them working for the people of this country?
Cat, thanks for your time today. That's Cat Hobbs from We Own It. Also been hearing from Martin Lynes, a farmer in Cambridgeshire and also the UK chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. Thank you, Martin. Nice to make your acquaintance. You've been listening to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, to the Byline Times podcast. Don't forget, our work is supported by subscribers to the Byline Times, our brilliant monthly newspaper. Do get a subscription if you can. Go to bylinetimes.com for more details. That's bylinetimes.com. Thanks very much indeed for listening. We'll see you again soon. Bye now. Cheers.